add value to your business, or do you want to just be this administrative person?
And often, if you look at your talent team and the caliber of talent in your company, they correlate.
You could hire the best person for the job if they were in your candidate pool.
All these individual employees, one by one, together, their voices all come together to articulate the culture of the company.
This is
Hiring on all cylinders.
Hey everyone, this is Jon Bischke, the founder and CEO of Entelo, and I'm here today with a special edition of Hiring on All Cylinders. I'm actually sitting in a recording studio in New York City, and today I'm going to be talking with Nathaniel Koloc. And Nathaniel has a really interesting background, most recently ran recruiting for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. And so I'm really excited today to dive more deeply with Nathaniel into how he looks at recruiting and tackle some really interesting topics. So Nathaniel, first of all, welcome and thanks for doing the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you, John.
So what I'd love to do is start out with your background, just a little bio on yourself. What did you do in the early stages of your career, kind of leading up to the role you had in last year's campaign?
Sure. So I'm from Pittsburgh and born and raised, and went to school in Vermont where I studied ecology and economics. And I got really into kind of climate environmental issues, graduated in 2008. And I bounced around a lot relative to like what my peers were doing. A lot of different projects. I worked for many different organizations in just a short period of time. And I got really into the idea of meaningful work. So when I was 24, I believe, started a recruiting firm called Rework with a couple of friends. The whole premise of it was helping, smart, earnest people get jobs at mission-driven companies that were specifically making the world a better place. So nonprofits, foundations, things like this. So I ran Rework for about 5 years, and I was CEO of Rework when the campaign got in touch. They got in touch with me before it was a publicly announced campaign, right? It was like in the run-up to it when they were kind of sourcing their initial teams, which is kind of a funny story about how that actually happened.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that story. I mean, obviously there aren't that many people who can say, I've been ahead of recruiting for a presidential campaign. How does one end up in that position?
How do you get recruited for that role? Yeah. So a couple years ago, I was actually sitting with a friend of mine from Pittsburgh. This is back in 2013 or something, and I was trying to explain to him why Twitter is good for your career. And I was saying, look, you can get in touch with people who you otherwise have no business getting in touch with, or you don't know them. And I thought to myself, he's in the world of politics. At the time, I wasn't. The Hillary's campaign was my first foray into politics. And I was thinking, who is somebody that he would think was impressive, but that isn't in my world? And I thought, I wonder who's the COO of Obama's re-election campaign in 2012. So I looked her up. She's not particularly famous. She's a talented operative, but not famous. Her name is Anne-Marie Habershaw. And so I tweeted at her and I said, hey, look, and I said, I run this recruiting firm. I was thinking whoever does hiring for campaigns must be good because there's no time, no money, all this pressure. So I tweeted her and I said, hey, I'd love to talk to you, maybe get some mentorship. I forget exactly what I said. Are you willing to talk? And she tweeted back in 2 minutes, right away. She was like, yeah, let's talk tomorrow or something. It's super fast. And he and I were both like, wow, that's crazy. So when talking to her, as soon as I got on the phone, I said those things. I said, basically what's your guidance in trying to build our company to be as effective as possible? And she said, no, actually, it was hard because there wasn't somebody on the campaign who was dedicated. They didn't have a talent role on Obama's campaign. So the teams are doing their own things. And so without that central coordination, her example was, sometimes you had senior people doing actual sourcing work, or if the deputies hadn't had experience recruiting, it was kind of problematic. So she said one of her main recommendations was going to be to put a talent person on for the next cycle, whoever the candidate was. And I said, oh, well, in that case, whoever you hire or whoever that person is, I would have ideas for them based on what we know. Kind of turned it around, and we had a conversation. So that was that, and then that was many years ago. And then she had passed my name along. So when they actually executed on her recommendation, they got in touch and started the conversation of feeling me out of were you interested in politics, could you see yourself doing something like this? So yeah, one thing led to another, and there I was.
It all started with Twitter.
Yeah, it all started with Twitter.
That's amazing. We like to promote the idea at Entelo that social media can be a powerful vehicle for finding jobs and finding people, and this is Exhibit A.
Yep, absolutely.
That's fantastic. Well, what I want to do is dive into some of the things. I think initially you got on our radar through a piece in Quartz, talking about your role on the campaign, and there were some pieces in that really struck me, and I consider myself fortunate to be able to sit here and be able to ask you these questions about some of the things that you said. One of the things that you said that I think, and kind of something that surfaced in talking to my team, is the fact that, effectively you're trying to recruit people for a campaign. Many people are leaving a full-time, steady, permanent job to come work on a campaign that at a minimum has an expiration date, right? The election's going to be over on November 9th. But at the same time, uncertainty past that. And clearly some people work on the campaign then and ultimately move on into roles in government. But how do you do that? How do you convince people to leave, the safety of whatever they're doing and come work on something that is at a minimum very uncertain? Yeah,
it's a great question. And I think what we found was, first of all, owning that, just totally owning the fact this is an adventure. This is not a typical job. This is the opposite. This is the once in a lifetime opportunity. This is a career. I would say all the time, this is a career adventure. It's not, you're going to work a lot, but it's not in the same bucket of just like a next career step kind of job thing. So in the one sense saying, look, this is really meaningful. If it resonates with you, this is the kind of thing that only comes around every now and then. Like, you really want to do this. Also, there's a way to say, it's good news that you're going to get you to another step at November 9th, right? Like, depending if someone was joining back in, 2015, and we launched in April or May of 2015, that was a long way out. I mean, a lot of people weren't even realizing that the campaign had a staff then. So we're educating people like, hey, look, we're already getting going. And if that's a year and a half, I mean, that's kind of almost like what you do at another job, right? Mm-hmm. So it changed when it got closer, like 3 months, 6 months, even that 9-month mark in 2016, in between that weird zone of like, at 3 months, someone can almost take a leave maybe, but at that like 6 to 9 months, I mean, we had to have people really, doing a gut check on were they good with the uncertainty. And I think we just sold it as you're gonna have the benefit of being able to like take another step soon and not have to wonder like, when are you going to move on for your next job? You know what I mean? Like, kind of like use that to our advantage.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I think it's something that whole notion of appealing to people around, this is a kind of a once in a lifetime thing. I mean, how many times do we get those opportunities, right? And I think that makes all the sense in the world. Well, you said another thing that also struck me, which was, this notion of not needing people who have done exactly the thing that they're going to do before. And clearly on a campaign, you're doing all sorts of things for the first time. Every single presidential campaign is like that. So how do you assess, you're interviewing, your team's interviewing someone and you're interviewing them for role X and they've never done X before. How do you assess the capability or the probability that they'll do a good job in that role?
Yeah. So this gets to, I think, a hiring a philosophy that I think is shared by, some folks in Silicon Valley, for example, that when people are, it's the looking for someone who's about to do the thing and not necessarily someone who's already done it. My answer is, this is one reason why it's really important to get good on scoping, because if you can really accurately, and accurately doesn't always mean specifically, you can be accurate and vague or say like, look, we think it's these things, you may also end up doing this. Putting that in front of somebody, so having really, really well done role descriptions and having them light up and say, "This, I want to do this, and here's why I want to do this," and hearing that motivation, that's one piece. And it underscores the importance of being able to articulate, what are you hiring for? What's the point of this role? Yeah. And the second thing is looking for analogs. So I think of it as evidence. It's like, what evidence do you have? So if I say, what evidence do you have that you can manage a $100 million budget? Evidence can look different ways. You can say, I was a deputy to somebody who did that and I looked at all their I saw their workflow. Or you could say, well, I've managed $10 million and I think that the 10X is like not a meaningful change, from that skill set. And those are both, I can consider both of those as possible evidence. So I think it's trying to piece together the analog things that point to their ability that they are likely to be able to do that. And then that growth mindset. Someone said, I think it may have been Mark Andreessen, someone had a thing around, you want people who hang their confidence and are more excited about what they're going to do, not what they've already done. And I completely agree with that. Like, anytime somebody is really landing super hard and sort of making the case for themselves purely on, well, I've done this, that's, to me, actually a sign that there's not as much of a growth mindset as I like to see. A lot of the work I've done tends to be in organizations that experience a lot of uncertainty. So like startups, smaller organizations, a lot of the mission-driven world is kind of, that the social sector is growing up, it has been growing up over the last decade. So it's not as clear-cut as like a corporate environment or something. So you need people who can handle uncertainty, and the growth mindset is just absolutely critical part of that.
I love that, and I think the notion of, there's different labels for it, but the notion of hiring an up and comer, right? Someone who maybe is doing something for the first time.
Yeah.
We think a lot about that at Entelo. It doesn't mean you should exclusively hire up and comers necessarily, but that notion that they're going to be very hungry, very motivated, right? Because they've never done this before.
Absolutely.
Versus someone who's like, oh yeah, I worked on 8 presidential campaigns and I've done all this stuff before. And like, well, do you really have the desire then to get in the ring and put in the long hours and the blood, sweat, and tears?
Well, and let's talk about that for a second, because even in that example, it can be problematic if somebody has had those experiences before, because the world shifts and changes. Sure. And when you use the same mental models before, so I won't say too much, but the point, literally the one you used, right? Like in a political environment, having run playbooks from the past doesn't mean that those playbooks are what's needed now. Mm-hmm. And when you have to deal with people's mental models, that actually, it could even set you back, right? It's not even just a question of like, could somebody else do this as well? It's like, could they actually do it better because they're going to be more like first principles learning in real time? You know what I mean? Like, I think, if I'm talking about for startups and also for campaigns, it's really important to have some fresh perspective. And I don't mean zany, creative, like throw things at the wall energy. I just mean approaching it with like, okay, what are the fundamentals? What do we know now? As opposed to saying, well, what did we do before?
Yeah. That makes all the sense in the world, and obviously you want to balance it with experienced leadership and people who do have those contexts to pull from. But if you're only doing people, or only bringing on people who have again been in this world forever, they probably aren't going to bring that fresh energy. Very similar to how I think you'd think about hiring for a startup.
Yeah.
Very, very cool. Well, talk to me a little bit about scaling the leadership around recruiting and training the leadership. I mean, you had all these different offices. You had people all across the country. When your team brought in people to run these offices, and they had to recruit people, were you looking for people that had recruited before? Were you saying, hey, even if people haven't recruited before, we'll train them how to recruit? And if the latter, how did you do that?
So I think I'll start with just a setup of the organization, because I think a lot of people don't know what actually goes into a campaign. So we had our headquarters in Brooklyn, and by the end of the campaign, so by the end of 2016, we had many thousands of people across, in the states, across the country. So the total amount of people was somewhere in the like 4,500 mark. So it's more people than I think a lot of folks realize on staff and place.
These were all full time.
Yeah, that's like paid full time. Yeah, that doesn't count like volunteers, of which there were like tens of thousands. So of that 4,500, somewhere around, I don't know exactly, somewhere between 600 and 800 were anchored at HQ or worked at HQ, and then the rest were out. So in the beginning, like the first, as we were entering the primaries, even pre-primary in 2015, we were mostly growing HQ, which looked, HQ, there's 11 different departments. It looks kind of like a full stack startup. You've got everything from lawyers and accountants and a budget team to like the fundraisers to digital, tech, analytics. Those are 3 different teams. Mm-hmm. You've got policy, you've got communication. So it's a full, like a full company. In the States, the organizing department, which includes everybody in the States, essentially, they were more like their own dedicated kind of skill set. So organizing is when you, political context, when you're out talking to voters, talking to volunteers who are going to talk to voters. So that I just mean to say that like the majority by the end of folks were in the organizing department, but like HQ was kind of the central kind of mothership. So the answer is it was different for different cases. Like my role was basically a service provider sitting within the operations team to partner with department heads, their deputies, and team leads. So at multiple levels to figure out like on a case by case basis for each team. Where were they? What did they need? For some, it was more sourcing work. For some, it was more, like in the beginning, we did a lot of interview process design, trial project design. And so my role was Director of Talent Acquisition and Development. So I was also holding space for manager trainings and, kind of like we did a pro bono coaching program where we got a partner who had a bunch of executive coaches who could come in and coach some of our leaders. So the answer is it was case by case and really depended on what those teams needed and their experience with hiring, which was all across the board. Mm-hmm. And in many cases, folks had done hiring in the sense that they had hired people, but they had never been trained in how to hire, and they didn't know, they wouldn't have been able to like parse out the difference between scoping, sourcing, screening, selecting, and like the frameworks that are best for those things. So a lot of the work in the beginning was establishing that body of sort of being on the same page, and then letting them say, okay, I think we need more help with this. So that's a long answer, but the way it wound up being was at volume. I mean, so to get to the, talking about the organizers, like we needed a system, and we wound up using Lever, which was great for us. We needed a system to organize the intake of however many, 15,000 or something resumes to get down to those 4,500-ish, or I guess 37 or whatever they were out in the States. And it was a combination of folks on the ground, going out to colleges and trying to recruit students to be organizers, and also them getting resumes piping in through essentially our marketing work from HQ, right? We had the website up, we were doing content, we were pushing, we did things like Facebook ads, and we did all kind of different things. And that combination got them what they needed. And a lot of that work was, we were kind of there as, we would send guidance, we'd say, hey, here's our take on like the most efficient way to go out and make this case. But they're all ultimately semi-autonomous in terms of how, the different states and cities decided exactly how they were going to do their part of the recruiting.
Got it.
Yeah.
And did you have an overall framework? I mean, you said they were semi-autonomous, but for example, were you trying to implement structured interviews or any pieces of the equation that you really did try to achieve consistency office to office, or did you see kind of a lot of variation based off of the? I mean, again, it's such a quick
it's
thing
fast
in terms of how fast it moves, right?
From a process standpoint, I think that by the time we were really doing that hiring work, because that was probably in June, July, August is when we were really growing it, to that amount. I think we're pretty consistent with like the interview questions that were getting asked, and the number of interviews and things like that. That said, campaigns are total chaos, so there was always a consistent 10 to 20% of like just who knows what's happening, and it's just happening because it's working and we're just going to do it. So sort of what we call my customization on the team's part, and that was just the reality. That's just the deal.
Yeah, excellent. And I wanted to double click on sourcing just briefly, because it's an area of great interest to our audience. Obviously, it's a big part of what we provide at Entelo. Kind of how'd you do it? How'd you feel about how you did it? What advice would you give to someone doing it in the future for a political campaign?
That's a good question. So. And so for some context, I had a staff of 3, and one of which was dedicated to the intern program, which was, I didn't even mention before, we had 800 interns over the course of the campaign come through and serve time at HQ and for the semesters. So with basically 2 staff and me, it was hard. As with any team, we could tell you, like, we'd love more people, we'd love more time and more money to spend on sourcing.
Everyone who's in recruiting would say that.
Yeah. So and we specifically had a policy of not using any recruiters. Like, we didn't pay recruiting fees, which is a key thing on the tech side, right? Like that just changed the dynamic a little bit of like what you have available to you compared to maybe like a funded startup. So my answer on sourcing was, I think a little bit because of the brand, because of who Hillary is and was, and just how well known she is, I think a lot of our work had more to do with correctly or efficiently organizing the inbound interests. That's not to say that I'll come to a second to the outbound work that we were doing, but especially on the organizer level, I was saying, like, our first order of business was make sure we're organized about how people are coming in, because also in the political space, folks know each other. Like, everybody in the campaign had some number of emails a day coming to them of like, hey, I'm ready to join, folks they worked with before. So we got a system pretty well in place at HQ where we would just be air traffic control for that. We would just, department heads would just forward those emails to me basically, right? And we would figure out, okay, like, we're going to interview this person. We had like a sort of the short list of folks that we had talked to who we weren't sure where their role they would go to, but then we would like route them out. So there's a little bit of that. In terms of the sourcing, I mean, we used LinkedIn in the beginning. Earlier on, as I said, when people weren't really paying attention to in, let's say, May, June, July of 2015, like, people knew Hillary Clinton was running for president, but I don't think the general population was really tuned yet. This was before all the hubbub and everything. So, yeah, there was a lot of education work. Most of what I was doing then was network activation, getting really wide-reaching email chains and like network listservs and just establishing like, hey, this is happening. The technical tools, this is all to say, I think we used fewer technical tools for actual sourcing work, and it was more trying to organize marketing level sourcing work. That said, there were certain roles, like the guy who built our entire operational backend, the app that controlled how everything was kept track of, the system of record. Like, we got him off LinkedIn. Like, someone on my team found him from General Assembly, and he was great. So there were examples of the more specific roles. The digital department, for example, they had videographers, they had designers, they had a digital ads team. I mean, they were a full stack media company, as I was saying, and so some of those roles are so specific that, like, we had to spend time, either on their behalf or with them or coaching them or having them set up to do that.
That's great. Well, I've got, I think, just one more question, which is, I'd love your thoughts. I think you have a very unique perspective on this one. In 2018 or 2019, someone is going to download this podcast who is going to be working on the next campaign, right? The next presidential campaign. And, what I would want to hear from you is, what advice would you give them? Now having been in the trenches, having seen this up close, having scaled an incredible organization in a very short amount of time, if that person was talking to you right now and you were saying, hey, I got to pass along one piece of advice, what would it be?
That's a great question. Well, so I think the main thing I would say is just recognize right away that that influence and authority are two different things, and it is absolutely critical that you spend the time of building trust, getting to know the teams. It's not to say that I didn't do that, but I think I did. It took me a minute to fully realize the scope of, like, how much there was to do. So in order to correctly prioritize, it was really important to get to a rapport with certain leaders where you're like, you just should do this, and not have to be like this long conversation, because they just trust that you are, like, know what you're talking about and looking out for them. So I would just say getting really sensible at that, like, right away at the get-go. And then, the playbook that we have, I think it worked pretty well I was very happy in terms of the experiment of, like, talent at the campaign. I was very happy with how it went, and, we got great. The operations team would do these things, like these sort of customer surveys and scores and stuff, and we did really well in those. So I think that it definitely brought a lot to the campaign, and I think just showing up to the whole scope of it. Talent is this multifaceted thing, and it's true that when you have somebody who's only looking through that lens, they can really highlight awareness, things that other leaders should be aware of, that those leaders are just focused on more the content of their work. So, you know what I mean? It's almost like my advice would be, like, trust your instincts, that if you're showing up to that work, that you do have something to contribute. And,
That's great. And especially when you're on,
which is probably true
territory, right?
Right.
It's a startup, it's a political campaign.
Yeah. And I think what I just said is probably true of, like, any like lead people role anywhere. Is, you want to have as much insight into how the business is operating as your teams do, because then you're the real partner. Exactly. You don't want to be in a situation of, transactional activity. That's hard for everybody. It doesn't work well.
We see that all the time with companies as they start to transition to thinking of talent more strategically, right? And to think about it as something that is really, the most important thing that they do, core to their
It's your
success.
whole company. It's who makes your products and services and your strategy. So
Exactly. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you for your service on the campaign. It was really remarkable to just read the history and all the things that happened in such a short amount of time. So thank you for that. And, we'll be tracking you and your upcoming adventures and excited to see, the future chapters for you. And thanks for the time today on Hiring on All Cylinders.
Yeah, you bet. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.